He's a sportsman, and he wants to watch the Olympics on TV. And being 1968, of course, it's a black and white TV. Earlier in that day, the men's 200 metres sprint had been won by the American Tommy Smith, with his compatriot, John Carlos, coming third and getting the bronze medal. And as that 11-year-old boy sits in front of the TV eating a sugar sandwich, they were going those days, he watches Tommy and John walk towards the podium. But he's surprised that they don't look very happy. They've just performed really well in a race and he thought they'd be smiling and happy, but they don't. They look tense, they look nervous, and he wonders what's going on in their minds. Tommy and John are walking towards the stadium and they're thinking about their experience that day running, what it meant to them, what it meant to the American people, what America means to them, what they mean to America. All these thoughts are going through their minds. Tommy is 28 and he was born in Gleason County in Mississippi. John, 29, is from New Jersey. 75 years before they were born, about the same gap in time between now and the end of the Second World War, that 75 years took them back to their great-grandparents who were slaves. Because both Tommy and John were black. In 1865, Tommy's great-grandparents, John's great-grandparents, were no longer slaves. The Civil War ended and they were released, but it didn't make an instant change. Just because the law changes doesn't mean that attitudes change. You don't suddenly become equal and well-respected. And by the time of the First World War, Johnny and Tommy's parents, grandparents, were fighting in that First World War, fighting in Europe to bring freedom to Europe. But they had to enlist into a separate regiment. They weren't allowed to join with the white soldiers. They were in a black-only regiment because of segregation, commanded by white officers. In the Second World War, again, Tommy's dad, Johnny's dad, both fought in the war, and Tommy's dad died in the war, fighting to bring freedom in Europe. Freedom that he didn't experience back home in America. And again, there was still segregation. The black soldiers were in separate conditions from the white soldiers. They weren't allowed to mix with them. Now, in 1964, just 4 years before the Olympics that we're talking about here, there was a civil rights bill finally passed through Congress, which overturned a lot of what they call the Jim Crow laws, which were prevalent in the South, which were restrictions on what you as a black person could do. You couldn't go and sit in the same restaurant with a white person. If you're on a bus, you'd have to sit in the back of the bus. You couldn't use the same restrooms, the same toilets. You couldn't marry a white person. These were restrictions that were in 1964. And in just 6 months before they raced, in April 1968, Martin Luther King, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, was assassinated in Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee. And following that, there were naturally outrage. There was demonstrations in the streets, and 50 years on, the same things happened after George Floyd was killed. The parallels were still there. So all these things were going on in Tommy and John's mind as they marched up onto the steps to be awarded the medals that they'd earned. But when they looked at that flag being raised up there, when they thought of the anthem, they thought of what it was meant to represent: equality, freedom, all men are created equal, and they felt that was really hollow. That was not something that they had experienced in their lifetime, or their parents, or their grandparents, or their great-grandparents. They were not equal in that society. And so, as the flag was raised, with a gloved hand, they raised their hand up in what was then known as a Black Power salute, and lowered their head in shame, because that flag was a hollow sham. It was sullied. It did not represent them. And the 11-year-old boy watching that felt that something was important was happening. He didn't fully understand it, but he felt that something was really important was happening there and then. And he knew that they had done something momentous. They protested, they made a mark, but that they would also pay the price for that, because in those days, athletics was amateur. You didn't get paid for it. You couldn't make a living running around a track. Tommy was a mechanic back in Mississippi. John worked in an office. And he knew that they were going to struggle when they got back home, as indeed they did. They were vilified. When they got back, there was lots of opprobrium heaped on them, hostility. And unfortunately, it took its toll on them. Tommy became more and more depressed. And eventually, in 1982, he took his own life. And John, he had a similar downward spiral, and he took to drink, drugs, and crime. And in 1989, in a botched liquor store robbery, he was shot 3 times and killed. But those 2 men, taking that action, protesting and putting themselves on the line, is what You Must Act is really about. It's taking a stand and accepting the consequences for it in order to stand up to injustice and make a change. And I encourage everyone to read the stories of Tommy and Johnny, to understand what went on in their lives, and also to understand what has happened here today. Thank you.